was born here in Davenport less than 2 weeks after the end of World War II. It was settled by German immigrants in the mid-1800s, and they brought with them a system of physical training called the Turnverein, and it was beginning to disappear when I was a little boy. My headquarters here now is in the center of downtown Davenport in an old, huge bank building. The Turner Hall was about 2 blocks from here, and I lived a little further, about 9 blocks away, and had access to that Turner Hall and another German settlement house and the YMCA all the way up till the 60s when the Turner Hall shut down.
So you described yourself growing up as a street kid.
There were a lot of poor kids like me after the war. I lived in what was called then a tenement. We were called street kids. If you've seen the Bowery Boys or the Little Rascals, it was somewhere in between that. Across the alley from where I lived, there was a junkyard. In those days, the early 50s, kids like myself were given a lot of freedom from around the age of 8. I was on my own a lot of the time and free to stay out fairly late. So downtown Davenport was my playground.
Some of the early influences, you said the Turner Hall, and then there was also the Friendly House.
Yeah, there's another gymnasium. We had a trampoline, wrestling mats, and heavy bag, speed bag. In the early 50s, particularly around 53, 54, I was about 9 years old then, little boys were encouraged to become what we would call more manly back then. And a lot of that came out of what happened during the Korean War. During World War II, the soldiers performed remarkably, but during the Korean War, back then, they saw a decline in the discipline and the readiness of our soldiers, and they tied it to something happening within the culture, particularly with young boys. So we were encouraged to box and wrestle and what we call functional gymnastics today. I grew up on trampolines and climbing high ladders and rope. We were using a lot of the old European equipment at that time, which has been rediscovered since the Berlin Wall went down in 1989. Our gym had medicine balls, and we did dumbbell drills. Kettlebells were around when I was a kid.
Early on in your training, from a very young age, you were also into the martial arts. You started judo at a young age.
I did. We started boxing and wrestling at about age 8, and here in Iowa, wrestling was important to our culture, and again, heavily influenced by German immigrants. So I began wrestling, and in high school, when I wasn't on probation or in trouble in school, and then I started training in judo in about 1960, and immediately gravitated toward it. It not only helped the wrestling, but it also added a cultural dimension, which I found quite attractive. My mother was a devout Catholic, and so I was sent off to an elementary school back when the nuns wore black dresses and white paper halos, and priests were depicted in movies as being without sin. And the nuns, I recall, were absolutely gorgeous. Oh my God. By second or third grade, I was in love with at least 2 nuns. They smelled like incense and pheromones and longing, and I was all over it. Early on, I wanted to become a priest. And actually, the first inclination was to become a knight. One day, Sister Joseph Mary crouched down when I was on the playground, right face to face with me, and boy, she was beautiful. And she asked me what I was going to do when I became a man. And without hesitating, I said, I want to be a knight. My instinct was that the knights protected the church and she was the church, but I really wanted to become a knight and then become a priest. And she told me that to be a knight, I had to grow up strong and I had to be honest and I had to protect the weak. And I took that all pretty seriously when I was a kid. Unfortunately, though, when I was barely a teenager, a Catholic priest tried to molest me. But my wrestling skills came in really handy. And I gave him a sharp elbow and I shucked him and told him to get away from me. But what really taught me a lesson in life back then was that nobody would listen to me. I went to the newspaper and they told me to get out. I went to the police and they told me to go home and tell my parents. And I went to the school and told a counselor, and she said I was a sociopath or liar. The word sociopath was really big back then. Anybody that didn't fit was called a sociopath. So finally, I said to my mother, Mom, Frances Bass is a pervert. And she was real quiet for a moment, and I just feel the pain on her face. And she looked down, and for a moment she was silent, and then she said, I know, stay away from them. That was the moment I realized that, by God, everybody knows this is going on, but no one's going to protect me or any other kids. So I think that really raised in me a rebellion. There was so much lying and evil around me, and it just fueled in me a desire to become stronger and more knightly. I got plenty of practice because I was a bully magnet. I mean, you know how bullies are. They're going to look for the weakest child, and so it encouraged me to train harder and become tougher.
That story is interesting, I think, especially for the younger generation now, because we've grown up after the scandal has become public knowledge with the Catholic Church and covering up molestations and pedophilia. And you were actually one of the few people who had documented over the years and was able to help bring justice.
Oh, I called the diocese often over the years, and I came back to Iowa. I'd been gone around 20 years, and I read in the newspaper at around 2000, 2001 that Davenport was being investigated. So I called the attorney. I said, is Frances Bass one of the priests being investigated? And the attorney said, oh, yes, he is. How do you know? And I said, well, I'm the fish that got away. And so he called me back and asked me if I'd ever taught at Northern Illinois University. And I said, yes. And he said, well, the diocese would only release one record of someone who's been calling, and they didn't include the name. I said, well, that was me. He said, would you be willing to testify, because the church refused to release any of the documents for privacy purposes? And so I went to court and I testified, and on my testimony then the church was then forced to release the documents. And I remember thinking back as a kid, the only word that I could come up with to describe what I was experiencing was a conspiracy, because everybody really knew about it, and I knew they knew over it. So over the years I began to consider the word conspiracy and apply it to my life. It comes from two Latin words, conspirare. It means something like to breathe together or of one spirit. And so it doesn't necessarily mean people sitting in a room somewhere making awful decisions. It really means silence as much as duplicity.
So turning back to when you're a young teenager, you rebelled, you didn't any longer trust many of the adults around you. You referred to yourself becoming Robin Hood. If you weren't going to be a knight, then you were going to be Robin Hood. Can you elaborate on that story?
I lived right around the corner from Skid Row here in Davenport. The hobos would come in on the Rock Island line in the summer, and they'd camp down along the river. And there were some rough characters. It was just tavern after tavern. And I lived just right around the corner from that. So there were a lot of bad people around, but there were a lot of poor people around me. And I lived a short distance from downtown Davenport. So at some point, I began to come downtown and shoplift. I remember coming away after a Saturday with probably 50 shirts, or more. I was just crazy. I'd steal it, and then I'd go hide it in an alley. And then I would take it and give it away somewhere. I remember one day I had half of Skid Row were all wearing paisley shirts. It was really colorful. But eventually that caught up with me. I was in 6th grade, my first arrest, and that was for receiving stolen goods. But then when I was 18 and I was an adult, I was leaving the scene of a really nice clothing store. I had about $3,000 worth of clothes in my 37 Plymouth Coupe or something like that. It was just packed with clothes, and the police happened to come down the alley behind us at about 4 in the morning, and I just told my buddy, jump, and we both jumped out of the car, and the car speared a concrete wall garage, went all the way into it, and totaled the car, and I ran to an alley, but I gave up. I knew they were coming. Facing 1 to 5 years. I was in college at the time, junior college, just finished a wrestling season at Blackhawk Junior College across the river from where I live here in Iowa. So the judge said, I'll put you on probation, but you have to go back to college. I found quickly that I couldn't go back to college until I got off probation, and I couldn't get off probation until I went back to college. So once I worked and paid all the money back for breaking all the doors in to get into the building and all the damage I'd done in the burglary, I went over to the Cook County State's Attorney's Office and did all my own legal work in the library. And then I filed a petition to vacate my own probation. And when I went before the judge and he asked me where my attorney was, I told him I did it all myself. He said, "You're done, you can go." So I was off probation. I headed down on a wrestling scholarship to Kirksville, Missouri, Northeast Missouri State, and stayed there until I quit a couple years after that, and I volunteered for the infantry and went into the Army.